Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Center for Critical Thinking, where we encourage meaningful and open-minded discussions, striving to understand all sides of an issue. I'm Tammy Kipp, your moderator for today's timely presentation by Sandy Parker on local and state election wrap-up. This should be a very interesting and lively discussion given our nail-biting and certainly contentious election. We are very fortunate to have our noted expert Sandy Parker provide us with the highlights and share her well-researched insights on what lies ahead. Sandy Parker is the founder and publisher of Sparker Soapbox, a nonpartisan blog, website, and e-newsletter whose mission is facilitating and encouraging informed voting in Collier County and throughout Florida. The 17-year Collier County resident is a popular speaker on state and local government topics to civic, leadership, and community groups, retirement communities, and adult education programs. She's an active member of the League of Women Voters of Collier County, the Greater Naples Chamber of Commerce, and the Press Club of Southwest Florida, and a graduate of the Greater Naples Leadership Program. Prior to moving to Florida, Parker held executive positions in accounting, treasury and investor relations, and several Fortune 500 companies. She received a BA with highest honors and honors in American Studies from Douglas College of Rutgers University and an MBA from University of Pennsylvania Wharton School. And before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping suggestions. We are excited to have your questions and comments, and we have a Q&A or chat button at the bottom of your screen, and if you send your comments in on that, we will be happy to repeat your answers and Sandy, or your questions, and Sandy will be responding with her comments and responses. And with that, I hand you Sandy Parker. Sandy.
Thank you, Tammy, and thanks to all of you for having me. I am going to share my screen. Let's see. I think you should be able to see that. So today what I'm going to do is a little bit of a wrap up about the elections, specifically focusing on how Florida and Collier County voted. And as Tammy said, we're using the webinar format, so I can't see you all. I so much prefer doing this in person and getting your reactions and being able to interact with you during the presentation. And I'm going to miss that, but we will take your questions. So as things come to your mind, questions, comments, just type them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them in the end. So with that, let's just get started. As I said, I'm going to talk about how Florida and Collier County voted. I'm going to do it in these little topics. I'm going to talk about voter turnout. Then I'm going to talk about how Florida voted in the federal and state elections, how we voted on the constitutional amendments, the Board of County Commissioners here in Collier County, and then the Conservation Collier referendum. And as I go through and review each result, since you all are critical thinkers, I ask that you critically consider these questions. Did the outcome of any particular race or referendum really change anything? And if so, how? And if not, maybe why not? What does the outcome say about we the people? And given the circumstances, what procedural or legal changes to the voting or election process would you make if you could? So starting first of all with voter turnout, statewide, we had huge voter turnout. 77% of eligible voters cast ballots. That's the highest since Bill Clinton defeated George H.W. Bush in his effort to win a second term in 1992. Nationwide, the turnout was a little bit less, about 67%, which was the highest nationwide voter turnout since 1900. Surpassing the 1960 election of JFK and the 2008 election of Barack Obama. huge voter turnout. Collier County, 90.4% of registered voters cast ballots. That is really huge. And for the second election in a row, Collier County had the highest voter turnout of Florida's 67 counties. Within the Collier County numbers, it's kind of interesting. The highest turnout was among registered Republicans. 94% of registered Republicans cast ballots. 91% of registered Democrats, and 83% of all others. So that's kind of an interesting statistic. Some of you may have seen the New York Times article yesterday that was titled, "Republicans Pushed to Restrict Voting, Millions of Americans Pushed Back." And the implication, the suggestion in the article was that the record voter turnout was in response to efforts to repress voting. So I wonder what you think about that. Do you buy that premise? What was the explanation for this unprecedented turnout? Was it because Donald Trump was such a divisive figure? Is that why we had such voter turnout? Or was it somehow related to the pandemic and the fact that voting election officials made it easier to cast ballots than in the past? What do we attribute this to? And then what do we think will be the effect going forward? In terms of the federal elections, as everyone knows, of course, Florida was one of the earliest states to complete its counts and publish its results. And President Trump won Florida with 51% of the vote to Joe Biden's 48%. The result was not as close as I was expecting and as many were expecting based on other recent statewide races. You may recall that in 2018, the elections for governor, US Senator, and Commissioner of Agriculture had to be decided by manual recount. So typically statewide partisan races, at least until now, have been much closer than this one was. And looking at Collier County, Trump did even better in Collier County as a percentage of the total, winning 62% of the vote. And I think that's an important takeaway. You know, Collier County is, Southwest Florida, in fact, is one of the most conservative areas in the state of Florida. But what was surprising was the fact that Trump got less than the typical 65% of the vote that Republicans get in Collier County. We have tended to vote really pretty consistently, 65% Republican, 35% Democrat in our partisan elections, and Trump came in at 62. So a question there is, what does that tell us about the Collier County Republican voter? Another comment, Tammy had asked me the other day, how many people cast a ballot in these elections but did not vote in the presidential election? And I was able to get that information from the Supervisor of Elections website. We had 209,352 ballots cast in Collier County. And out of those, 1,067, or about 0.5%, did not vote for president. So we can speculate about the reasons for that as well. Turning to the US House of Representatives, Republicans, while still in the minority, increased the number of seats that they held. And as you know, all 435 seats in the House are on the ballot every 2 years. So this is a little bit of a busy chart, and I use this throughout the presentation. So let me just give you a second to get familiar with it. Across the top, party, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, vacant. There were some vacant seats prior to the election, and then the total number of seats is 435. So pre-election, Republicans had 197 seats in the House, Democrats 232. There was 1 Libertarian and 5 vacancies. As of this morning, all but 2 of the House races have been finalized, and Republicans picked up 14 seats. So Republicans as of now have 211 seats, Democrats 222. The Libertarian lost his seat, and the vacancies will be filled. So we're waiting on those 2 other races. But what we do see here is even though the Democrats retain control, it is a much slimmer majority than it had been going into these elections. And of course, in the US Senate, we're waiting on the outcome of the 2 runoffs in Georgia, which will be on January 5th. Similar to the changes in the US House as a whole, Republicans picked up seats in Florida's congressional delegation as well. So now we're looking at the 27 seats that Florida representatives hold in the US House of Representatives. And going into the election, as shown on the first line, Republicans barely controlled the delegation with 14 of the 27 seats. In what was considered an upset, Republicans retook the 2 seats that they had lost to Democrats in 2018. And that changed what had been a slim majority back to a healthy 16-11 majority in the delegation now. The 2 seats that flipped were congressional districts 26 and 27, which both represent parts of Miami-Dade County. And you've probably heard that Republicans did much better with Cuban voters, Cuban-American voters in this election than they had in the past. And that is considered to be at least part of the explanation for that flip. And then finally, turning to Collier County, so 48% of Collier voters live in Congressional District 19, which is the seat that's currently held by Francis Rooney. Republican Byron Donalds won that seat with 61% of the vote against Democrat Cindy Banyai. He got 65% of the vote in Collier County. So there's that 65% I was telling you about. And as you know, Donalds for the last 4 years represented part of Collier County in the state legislature, representing House District 80 for the last 4 years. A little bit about him. In his congressional campaign, Donalds described himself as, quote, a conservative leader who will bring the fight to the swamp creatures in Washington, D.C. He liked to say he's everything the fake news media says doesn't exist. A Trump-supporting, liberty-loving, pro-life, pro-Second Amendment Black man. Donalds is one of at least 8 freshman lawmakers that are forming a new Republican group called the Freedom Force. The group says that it opposes socialism and intends to serve as a counterbalance to what they call Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Socialist Squad. Now, outgoing Congressman Rooney was known for and actually quite proud of his willingness to work across the aisle. He served as co-chair of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, for example. In Donalds, District 19 is getting someone very different. So the question to think about here is, 9 Republicans ran for this seat in the Republican primary. Donalds won. Has the political profile of the District 19 Republican really changed as much as the difference between these 2, the outgoing and the incoming congressman, would suggest? What accounts for that significant change? How widespread is that? So now let's move on to the state government offices on the ballot, specifically the Florida legislature. Republicans have controlled the Florida Senate since 1992 and the Florida House since 1996. This year, 20 of the 40 Florida Senate seats were on the ballot, and 4 of those 20 races were considered competitive. 1 was a Democratic-held seat, and the other 3 were Republican-held districts. Republicans won all 4, gaining 1 seat and expanding their majority from 23-17 before the election to 24-16 after the election. Of concern is the fact that candidates for 3 of those Florida Senate seats did no campaigning or fundraising, they had no issue platforms, and they made no effort to get votes. It is suggested that their presence in the races was intended to siphon votes from Democratic candidates. If that's not bad enough, consider this about the Democrat-held seat that flipped. There were 3 candidates running for that seat. Republican Ileana Garcia, who is the well-funded founder of Latinas for Trump, Democrat Jose Javier Rodriguez, the incumbent, and an independent candidate named Alex Rodriguez. Obviously, the race was between Garcia and the incumbent Democrat, but look how close it was. After a manual recount, Garcia won by just 32 votes. And look at that. The other Rodriguez got 6,382 votes. And what about that independent candidate? Well, it turns out he's a one-time mechanic with no history in local politics, who never set up a campaign website, attended no candidate forums, and received no political contributions. The Miami Herald says Miami-Dade prosecutors are looking into this situation, but it's a dark money source with an out-of-state address, and it'll be very difficult to reach them. The candidate, meanwhile, has hired a lawyer who won't let his client talk. The Herald says that Rodriguez was not the only shadow candidate in Florida Senate elections. Interestingly, so far, Florida's Republican leadership has no plans to address the situation. So that's how the Republicans gained a seat in the Florida Senate. Republicans also gained 6 seats in the Florida House, further solidifying their control. Before the election, they had 72 seats, Democrats 48. Of the 120 seats on the ballot, just 15 were considered to be competitive, and Republicans won the overwhelming majority of them. And they flipped 6 seats. Needless to say, there's no incentive for bipartisan compromise when one party has such a firm control of both chambers as well as the governorship. In terms of Collier County in the Florida legislature, parts of Collier fall within 3 different state house districts. The county is outlined in this map in red, and you can see 106 on the west coast, 80 in the lavender, and 105 in turquoise. 80, which includes northeastern Collier County, has 36% of Collier County voters. 106 on the west coast has 52% of Collier County voters, and 105 in turquoise includes just 12% of Collier County voters. So let's look at these races. Incumbent Republican Bob Rommel defeated challenger Sarah McFadden for the District 106 seat. That's that district on the West Coast. Rommel did a point better than the 65% vote I mentioned that Republicans typically get in Collier County. He'll be returning for his third two-year term, and he will again lead the Collier County legislative delegation. This is the homepage of his campaign website, and he pitched himself as conservative, compassionate, and committed to you. Newcomer Republican Lauren Mello defeated Democrat Laura Novosad for the District 80 seat that had been held by Byron Donalds. Mello got that typical 65%. Her website says she's a conservative we can trust. She says she supports our president and will fight to protect our Second Amendment rights, honor our veterans, cut bureaucratic red tape, and grow the economy. In 1991, she started her own trucking company, and today she owns a real estate brokerage firm. And then finally, Republican David Pereira won the House District 105 seat. That was the one that in the turquoise that extends over to the East Coast. Notice that he got 57% of the vote. Why? Well, Collier County, remember, just 12% of Collier County voters live in District 105, and we're picking up a lot of voters from the eastern coast of the state. So 57% of the voters elected Barrero as the state representative for that seat. Like Mello, he is new to state government, but not to politics. He's been serving as an elected City of Sweetwater commissioner. On his website, Barrero, just like Rommel and Mello, highlighted that he's a conservative. So that's it for the state elections. I think you could see we've got Republican control strengthening across the board. Now let's look at those constitutional amendments. You'll remember that there were 6 proposed amendments to the Florida Constitution on the ballot, and an amendment requires at least a 60% vote to pass. So let's see how we voted on them and how things might change as a result. So starting with Amendment 1, remember that was the citizen requirement to vote in Florida elections. The Florida Constitution previously said, every citizen of the United States who's at least 18 years of age and who's a permanent resident of the state, if registered as provided by law, shall be an elector of the county where registered. And Amendment 1 changed the first 2 words of the provision to say only a citizen of the United States can vote. The amendment sponsors believed that the language as originally written did not explicitly prohibit non-citizens from voting, and they spent over $8 million to get this amendment on the ballot. It did pass with 79% of the vote. 82% of Collier County voters voted for it. So the question is, how will this change anything? It doesn't change anything in Florida because only citizens can vote in Florida, even before the change. Amendment 2, raising Florida's minimum wage. Amendment 2 raises the minimum wage to $10 an hour from the current $8.56 per hour, effective September 30th, 2021. Annually thereafter, it raises the minimum wage by $1 per hour until it reaches $15 per hour in 2026. And then further increases in the minimum wage are adjusted annually for inflation. The state's estimating conference estimated that the effect of the annual wage, the effect on annual wage costs in the state would be about $16 million in the first year, increasing to about $540 million in 2027 and thereafter. The amendment passed with 61% of the vote. 55% in Collier County. So think about that. Given the fact that typically we see 65% of Collier County voters voting for the Republican candidate, I thought it was interesting that 55% of the Collier County vote supported this amendment. This is an amendment that is unpopular to business, as you would imagine. Florida's business community is not happy. Opponents of the amendment included the Florida Chamber of Commerce and the Florida Restaurant and Lodging Association. So just like we saw with Amendment 4 a couple of years ago, the Rights Restoration Amendment, which the drafters of the amendment thought was pretty self-explanatory, self-executing, I'm hearing that the legislature doesn't think this is going to be self-executing. They're expecting that there will be implementing legislation written, and I suspect that what that means is that there will be businesses, industries exempted from this $15 minimum wage amendment that's passed. So we're just going to have to wait and see what happens with the upcoming legislative session on that. Amendment 3 was all voters vote in primary elections for state legislature, governor, and cabinet. That would have replaced Florida's closed primaries with a form of primary known as a top 2 or jungle primary. All candidates would have appeared on the primary ballot, and the top 2 vote getters, regardless of party affiliation, would then advance to the general election. This amendment failed, receiving 57% of the vote, 49% in Collier County. Remember, it required 60% to pass. Again, it's a bit surprising that a larger percentage of Collier County voters did not oppose the amendment, since both political parties did oppose it. That tells me that many people would like to see some sort of open primary in Florida, although not this particular one. Amendment 4 was voter approval of constitutional amendments, and it would have required constitutional amendments to be approved by voters at 2 successive general elections to become effective. Currently, as we said, it just requires a 60% vote in one election to become effective. This amendment also failed, receiving 48% of the vote, 50% of the vote in Collier County. Amendment 5 was limitations on homestead property tax assessments and an increased portability period to transfer an accrued benefit. This amendment increases from 2 years to 3 years the period during which the Save Our Homes benefits can be transferred when a taxpayer sells a homesteaded property and then buys a new one. Save Our Homes is a state property tax benefit that limits the increase in the assessed value of homestead properties to 3% a year. So passing this amendment is giving taxpayers a benefit, right? And the amendment then passed with 74% of the vote, 80% in Collier County. My observation is that anytime there's been a tax benefit of any kind on the ballot, either bills in the legislature or amendments coming before voters, they always pass. Similarly, Amendment 6, like Amendment 5, it relates to the homestead exemption. Amendment 6 deals with an additional property tax benefit that disabled veterans receive. Initially, that benefit expired upon the veteran's death, and this amendment would allow the benefit to be transferred to the veteran's surviving spouse. And it passed with 90% of the vote, 92% in Collier County. This amendment had 2 things going for it. It was a tax benefit and it benefited veterans. Those are two things that are sure wins for Collier County, for Florida voters, in my experience of watching these things over the years. So that's it for the amendments. Moving now to the Board of County Commissioners. The only local elections on the race were these on the ballot in November were these Board of County Commissioner elections. As a reminder, Collier voters live in one of 5 county commission districts as shown on this map. Even though they're different size, they have roughly the same populations. The voters in each district elect a commissioner who lives in the district. And here you see the commissioners who were sitting at the time of the elections. Commissioners serve for 4-year terms, and effective with commissioners elected in 2018, we now have term limits of 3 consecutive terms. District 2, represented by Andy Solis, and District 4, represented by Penny Taylor, are on the ballot during midterms, and Districts 1, 3, and 5 are on the ballot during presidential election years. So they would have been on the ballot this year. Nobody challenged Bert Saunders, who was running for re-election, and so he just automatically gets another 4-year term. And in November, the voters who lived in Districts 1 and 5 had a commission race on their ballot. District 1, incumbent Donna Fiala said she was retiring, leaving an open seat. Republican Rick Locastro won the seat with 69% of the vote, defeating Democrat John Jenkins. It's not at all surprising that the Republican candidate won. What was unusual is that the Democrats had a candidate to field at all. In past years, they have not, given the overwhelming Republican makeup of the district. Locastro ran on his resume. He's a retired Air Force colonel who had held leadership positions at Physicians Regional Medical Center and Avow Hospice, and now heads a business consulting firm. So what will be different with Locastro as opposed to Fiala? I suspect that Locastro will vote pretty much the way Fiala would have voted on anything coming before the commission. There's one matter that I'm not sure about, and that's about a zoning approval that's needed by a supermajority of the commission to permit marijuana dispensaries to locate in the county. You'll remember that several years ago, Florida voters passed an amendment to the Constitution allowing medical marijuana. We do not have them in Collier County because of a zoning change is needed in order to have them. Donna Fiala was one of 2 commissioners who did not approve the voting change. What will Locastro do when this comes before the commission? I asked him and he told me that he had not decided. And then in District 5, which was the other seat on the ballot, we had the incumbent Bill McDaniel easily winning a second term with 59% of the vote. What was interesting here was it was a 3-way race. Ray Christopher is a Republican. He chose to run as a no party affiliation candidate. So 59-6 is the Republicans' traditional 65% vote. Democrat David Turrubiartes got 35%. Again, unusual for the Democrats to have fielded a candidate at all. We won't see anything different because we've elected the incumbent again for another 4 years. So I don't expect a lot of change coming out of these county commission races. This was Bill McDaniel's webpage. He does have a long-standing record of leadership in our community. Finally, we had the Conservation Collier referendum. Let's see how we voted on that. You'll remember that Conservation Collier is a tax. It's taxing the citizens in order to reestablish funding for a land acquisition program that was first approved by voters in 2002. Its purpose is to acquire, preserve, restore, and maintain vital and significant threatened natural lands, forest, upland, and wetland communities in Collier County for the benefit of present and future generations. It's a $250,000 tax. That's the equivalent of $25 a year for each $100,000 of taxable property value, or $75 a year for a $300,000 home. It's expected to raise $250 to $300 million over the next 10 years. The referendum passed decisively with 76% of the vote. That compares to 59% when it was first put to the voters in 2002 and 82% when it came back in 2006. Again, I think it's interesting that significantly more Collier County voters voted to tax themselves for this program than the 62% that voted for President Trump. So that concludes my recaps of the November elections. These were the questions that I asked you to think about. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to discuss some of them. I do hope that the presentation gave you some insights into what the results might mean for us going forward. And then before we get to your questions, I just want to let you know where to find me. My website is sparkers-soapbox.com. My email is sandy@sparkerssoapbox.com. Many of you know that I publish monthly email recaps of state and local government news to help readers be more informed voters. I also do presentations, I'm now doing them on Zoom, about our state and local government, and I'll have my Government 101 presentations, which is really good for new people to Florida and to Collier County. That'll be coming up again in January. So if you're not already a subscriber, I hope you'll go to the website or email me to sign up. And with that, I think we're ready to take questions.
Okay, first of all, Sandy, thank you so very much for doing an outstanding job trying to make sense out of a very contentious and nail-biting election this year. I'm sure this was the election of all elections, at least in my lifetime. We have several questions and comments from Seymour Birchman, and bear with me here. His first question is, are voting means such as by mail determined by state legislatures? Given that most are Republican, does that mean we go back to only in person?
Yes, so it is the, well, yes, it is the state legislature, and then under the executive branch, so under the governor, is the Division of Elections under the Secretary of State. Florida has had mail voting, no excuse mail voting for many, many years. We're well ahead of a good part of the country when it comes to mail voting. Our election supervisors encourage mail voting. I do not expect to have it go back to only in-person voting in Florida, not at all. And given the success of these elections and how proud Florida is that we are no longer the land of hanging chads. We got great marks for pulling our elections off so well this year. So I think we can expect that to continue.
Yes, and we are no longer Florida.
Right.
Okay, and let me give you his comment here, and I'll get to his other questions. He says, this is again Seymour, he says, my view of the GOP really stands for no policy or platform, just for Trump and against what Dems want. I'm a Republican and I'm disappointed in the party. So given that, I'm going to get to his second question. Will the legislature undermine minimum wage increase as it did with felon voting rights, which you touched a little bit on?
Yeah, I'm concerned about that. We'll just have to wait and see what comes out of the legislature. I think that I don't see how, well, I don't have any insight there other than knowing that there is already talk of wanting to pass implementing legislation, and we'll just have to see what they do with it.
Mhm. And his last question, what is the process for getting amendments on the ballot? Has there been debate as to changes in the process?
Well, so there are, I think, 5 ways of getting of amending Florida's constitution. Florida has more ways to amend its constitution, I think, than any other state in the nation. And this is something that I cover in my Government 101 presentation. What we had this year were amendments that were put on the ballot by the legislature. So if the legislature votes to put something on the ballot, it immediately happens. It does not require the governor's approval. Another way is citizen initiative. And we had several citizen initiatives this year, including the minimum wage. Amendment 4, the rights restoration several years ago, was a citizen initiative. The legislature has made many changes to the process of citizen initiatives over the years to make it more difficult to get them onto the ballot, and then once on the ballot, what it takes to get them passed. So I mentioned that now it requires a 60% vote to amend the Constitution. That 60% used to be 50% up until maybe 8 or 10 years ago, when by constitutional amendment, it was changed to require 60%. You saw that we had an amendment on the ballot this year that failed, which would have required not just a 60% vote once, but then it would have had to come back a second time for a 60% vote. I mean, so interestingly, and personally, I think it's a good thing that the voters turned that one down. There's a whole history of why the founders or the drafters of this Florida Constitution felt that it was necessary to provide for the citizen initiative. It's a very important way for voters to have a say in the legislative process, particularly when, as we've seen, you have single party control for as long as we've had it.
Thank you. A couple of other questions from some other folks. First of all, Grace is saying what an outstanding job you did. From Francie Hunt, what is the legal status of the District 37 race with the second Rodriguez candidacy? Is this illegal? It certainly smells rotten.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. I was hoping somebody would bring that up. It is not illegal. And my husband and I were just talking about the other night, like, so what would you do? You would pass a law that says anybody can run for office as long as their motives are pure, but if their motives are not pure, they can't, right? I mean, what would you do to make it illegal? And yet in this case, it is so blatantly clear that, and it's even been said that there was a former Florida legislator who admitted that he actually literally looked for somebody with the same last name, Rodriguez, as the Democrat incumbent, with the idea of confusing enough voters to pull the votes again away from the Democrat. Not illegal, definitely smells, and not sure what can be done about it. What other than that, voters need to be a little bit better informed. You know, that's those 6,000 people who voted for Rodriguez and maybe voted for the wrong one. That's terrible, right?
Mm-hmm. Little shady. We know what tricks they're up to. Regarding the amendment requiring citizenship in order to vote, in your opinion, what was the purpose of that amendment?
So the group that sponsored that is trying to get that amendment passed across the country, not just in Florida. And apparently, from what I've read, there are other states where non-citizens can vote in perhaps school board elections, for example. They're legal residents, and in that jurisdiction, they have the right to vote in those local races. So the idea is to the extent people think that non-citizens should not be allowed to vote, that's what this would have prevented. Now in Florida, we don't have that situation. To me, so, you know, I'm not sure what to say about it. It doesn't change anything in Florida, but the fact that a group spent $8 million to collect the signatures to get it on the ballot seems strange to me. I'm not sure that I responded to the question. The whole thing seems bizarre to me. And yet, look how many people voted in favor of it.
Yes, well, they probably thought people were not required to be citizens, so.
But I mean, it was so clearly written in the Constitution anyway, but I guess not.
Yeah. Siam Kafaso, the shadow candidates propped up using dark money are a disturbing trend. Until that is resolved, we the people are not being fairly represented. Thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And this is, from Bill Pope. Thank you for the soapbox. Excellent and informative. The Republicans did better this year with Cuban Americans. Do you know how other Hispanic votes broke down in Florida, Puerto Rican voters, for example?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I don't. But one thing that we've heard over and over again is that the Hispanic vote or the Latino vote is not monolithic. And there are many, many subgroups and subcultures that need to be understood and taken into consideration. And from what I read, the Republican Party in Florida did a very, very good job and started working on that very early. I would like to come back to the comment about the shadow candidates and just mention, again, some of you have attended my previous talk or read in Soapbox. During the primaries, because Florida has primaries, we have this situation called the write-in loophole. And it's sort of similar to what we saw here, where you have this shadow candidate. With the write-in loophole, you have somebody who files to run as let's say you've only got Republicans running for a particular, in a primary. And the way the Constitution is written is we have closed primaries unless all of the candidates are of one party, and that would mean that the primary is going to basically determine who the winner of the election is. And if that happens, then everybody gets to vote in the primary. So the way around that's been devised is that, and it's in our case, it's Republicans, but it's equally done on the other side, but I'm going to use the Republican case. So the Republicans would get somebody to file to run as a no party affiliation candidate. And then they would say, our primary gets to stay closed. Only registered Republicans can vote in our primary to choose the Republican Party candidate who will then on the general election ballot go up against that no party affiliation candidate. And the point is that that no party affiliation candidate isn't really a candidate any more than this other Rodriguez was a candidate. The purpose was to keep people who are not registered Republicans from being able to participate in choosing their representative. So this kind of thing, this is the first time I've seen this happen in the general election like this, but I've been watching it happen in the primaries for years. And so I'm glad that you all are interested enough to pay attention to this, and we have to make sure people know about it and are informed when it comes to voting.
Thank you. A couple of other questions. Were former felons ultimately allowed to vote or not? And I think I know the answer to this. Yes. Yeah.
There were some who were. The way it stands is that they have to have paid all of their fines and fees and restitution. And to the extent that they could find out how much they owed and could pay it, then they were able to vote. But it was a very small number of the total number of former felons whose rights should have been restored by that amendment.
Yeah, that was an interesting twist. Another question, what will it take to have the Planning Commission elected directly by the public instead of appointed by the BCCC and have the CCPC responsible for development?
Oh, interesting question. So Collier County's form of government is set forth in the Florida Constitution. So over the years, Collier has from time to time considered adopting a charter form of government. And if it did adopt a charter form of government, it could then decide how the Planning Commission, who the elected bodies would be, and could do that however the voters chose to. But right now, the way the Constitution is written and our county form of government doesn't allow it.
From Richard Stein, 2 in a row is good to discourage impulse, trendy, or emotional decisions. Another comment from Seymour Berkman, my question about return to in-person voting applied to all states, not just Florida. So,
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. One other question, you said Republicans have had control of the Florida House and Senate since the 1990s. Is that due to gerrymandering? What's likely to happen as a result of the redistricting after the 2020 census? Might Democrats get more seats as a result?
What a great question.
That's a great question.
So Florida voters passed Fair Districts constitutional amendments in 2000 and when was it? 8, maybe? I forget. So there had been gerrymandering. The Constitution was revised to basically say you cannot gerrymander district, you can't draw district lines to favor political parties. Then we had the 2010 census and the legislature drew districts. And the League of Women Voters of Florida said, wait a minute, these districts that you drew are still gerrymandered. And so they sued the Florida legislature. It went all the way up to the Florida Supreme Court. Ultimately, the Supreme Court said, legislature, you're doing such a bad job. You're just not able to draw districts that are not politically gerrymandered. We're going to go with these maps that the League of Women Voters drew. And those were the maps that were adopted and have been governing our districts since the decision in 2014 or 15. So now here we are. Supposedly, the districts that we're in now are not politically gerrymandered. And up until this year, our statewide elections have been very, very close. So, and the outcome of the elections in terms of the partisan split of the Florida House, as we saw, was pretty close until just this year. So all of that sort of suggests that the districts as they now stand are not gerrymandered. However, this legislature that was just elected will be the legislature that draws the districts following the 2020 census. And those new districts, who knows whether they're going to try to politically gerrymander them or not. We will have to, again, see what's done. And then groups like the League of Women Voters of Florida and other voting rights groups will look at the districts and make a determination as to whether they think they're politically gerrymandered. And if they are, we may go through the litigation all over again. But that's the process.
Mm-hmm.
So whether we'll have more Democrats after the new redistricting, it really, really remains to be seen.
Okay, and I think that is wrapping up all the questions that we have. And what an interesting outcome and amazing election that we had. And you did a fabulous job making sense of all of it, and especially the Florida impact. And I think so many people, it impacts us directly, and you shed some light on the background and the backdrop of all of that. And we can't thank you enough. And also for expanding the critical thinking for the Center for Critical Thinking. And we look forward to having all of the participants attend our next webinar, and appreciate everybody's input. So thank you all very much. And we look forward to seeing everybody sometime soon, hopefully in person, one day soon. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.